Good morning. Thank you for coming to this Oceania semester presentation with the very intriguing title of Cargo Cult Post-Mortem. And of all the Oceania semester events this semester, this is one of the two or three that I've been most looking forward to, hearing more about this strange phenomenon in the South Pacific. We'd like to encourage you to take the survey at the conclusion of Dr. Lindstrom's presentation. You can find the QR code and the URL inside the Oceania semester brochure. The event code for the 11 o'clock presentation is 5688, 5688. So write that down, and at the conclusion of his talk, go online or scan in the QR code and take that survey, and you'll be entered into a drawing for a $1,000 study abroad grant. So the more events you attend and the more surveys you complete, the better chance you'll have of winning that $1,000 study abroad grant. So we're delighted to have Dr. Lamont Lindstrom with us. He's chair of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Tulsa, where he's been a faculty member since 1982. He has a master's and a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. The Joplin Globe called me a couple of days ago to do a preview story of his three presentations, and the reporter said to me, "He's really a big deal, isn't he?" And I said, "He sure is."
I don't know how big.
Dr. Lindstrom has written numerous books, co-authored other books, written journal articles, made presentations, and what I like most, I think, is that he's traveled to this country of Vanuatu, which makes up one of the 14 countries of Oceania, at least 20 times. So, it would be great to be an anthropologist and get to do field research on some of these rather unique islands. So, he'll be here also at 1 o'clock talking about volcano tourism in Vanuatu. And I'm eager to hear that one too. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lamont Lindstrom.
I won't clap, but I'll shake your hand. Well, thank you, Professor Stebbins, and thanks everybody in the Oceania semester for inviting me up here from Tulsa. I'm an anthropologist, and this morning's talk is a bit about the history of an odd sort of social movement that popped up in the Pacific last century, but also something about the history of anthropology. So it's called Cargo Cult Post-Mortem. So cargo cult, for a variety of odd reasons, became the label for social resistance movements that were especially noticeable after World War II. Anthropologists were always a bit embarrassed by that term, that label. And many of us over the years declined to use it. But many people outside the field of anthropology thought it was a cool word, and we'll see in a minute, have used it for all kinds of strange reasons. So I'm calling it post-mortem, so this is like a autopsy of the cargo cult. Rightly so, in that there really aren't any more cargo cults out there in the world, and there maybe never were any, although there certainly were lots of social movements, resistance movements of a variety of sorts on many Pacific islands, as there have been and are all across the world. So I got into this story when I was a student like you. I wanted to travel, and I figured anthropology was a great way to be able to travel, and it's been, throughout my career. And I've been lucky enough to go back and forth to a little island in the country of Vanuatu. And one of the reasons I first went to this small island, it's called Tana, is it had a cargo cult. At least I thought it had a cargo cult. And I was back in the developmental studies days, and I was going to compare the economic activities of what I thought would be Christian families versus cargo culting families versus pagan or heathen families, and look for differences in their interests in participating in what people back then talked about as economic development. And it was a kind of, if anybody's had in your sociology classes had to read Max Weber, who wrote a famous book about the Protestant ethic, which he figured might have been involved in the origins of capitalism in bits and pieces, different places in Europe. I was going to take that approach and try to apply it in this small island in the South Pacific. It was a totally crazy idea, and in fact, I did the kind of research I said I was going to do, but I found many, many more interesting things to get into. But there was, and there still is today, one of these social movements which has been institutionalized. It's now a political party in a church, and it starts in the 1930s. So, Tana, we'll see some of this stuff in a minute. So here's the Pacific. Oh, I get to use a fancy thing. Here is Vanuatu, and I ended up right on an island right about there. So in the history of anthropology, if anybody ever takes an anthropology class, before World War II, anthropologists were they went out to describe societies and cultures around the world, trying to figure out how they ticked. So they were, what anthropologists often, they were called functionalists, right? So this is there in this society because it has a use, a need, it fills a need, it has a function. And they weren't that much interested in social change. So some of the early anthropological work out there, written up by a kind of Austria-Hungarian Polish guy named Bronislaw Malinowski, who was working out of the London School of Economics, wrote a famous book in the 20s. Also in the 20s, Margaret Mead, some of you may have heard her name. She was a well-known American anthropologist of the 20th century. She went to Samoa and she studied adolescents, she studied teenagers and kids. What happened? Sunday, September 7, 1941, the Japanese Empire bombs Pearl Harbor, and at least the American involvement in the war begins, right? And part of that involvement is in Europe, but part of it is in the Pacific. So the U.S. Moves down into the Pacific Islands. The Japanese are coming down from the north, and they're already on the north side of the big island of New Guinea. They're building a base in the Solomon Islands, which, I don't know if we go back to the map here, which is, if I can figure my thingy here, is down here, they're on Guadalcanal. So the U.S. comes down through New Caledonia and then moves north into Vanuatu and establishes two large bases, a big one on the biggest island of Vanuatu, an island called Espiritu Santo, and another one, and a second one. So nobody had heard about normal people, a few anthropologists might have been out there, and colonial administrators were out there in those days, but nobody had heard of the cargo cult before World War II. And what World War II does, and we'll see in a minute, is it turns anthropological attention towards issues of social change. So before the war, everybody went out and they wanted to describe a nice, quiet society like Samoa or the Trobriand Islands, and they could write a nice book or a series of books about these places. Here's how the economic system works, and here's how the chiefs work, and here's how the religion is. After the war, anthropologists and everybody got more interested in what's going on. Things are changing, so we need to start paying attention to social change. And that's when the cargo cult gets pulled into the story, because cargo cult, or any kind of movement of people where they're demonstrating, they're doing new things, they're not happy, clearly existing social systems are in trouble. People are trying to seek change. They're trying to transform, their lives. So anthropologists figure that, we ought to start paying attention to cargo cult. Well, they didn't have a word for social movements in the Pacific. There was a previous term that had come out of Papua New Guinea, the Australian colonies in New Guinea, called Vailala madness. That these crazy villagers have gone mad and that they're running around and burning down their traditional carvings, and they're marching here and marching there, and they're doing strange things, so they've obviously gone crazy. Well, madness wasn't a very suitable label for resistance movements, social movements. Cargo cult wasn't much better, but it was the one that anthropologists borrowed. They didn't invent it, they borrowed it. It's kind of hard to see here. They borrowed it from an Australian planter who was run out of New Guinea, like most Australians, when the Japanese started to come down, and when the Australians and the Americans began, the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the beginnings of the Pacific War, and pushing the Japanese back. The Australian planters, they were Australians who had come up into that colony in order to grow, to establish coconut plantations mostly. He wrote a letter at the end of the war saying, "Oh, we got to watch out. These Papua New Guineans are getting dangerous ideas. They don't want to work for 2 shillings a day anymore." And some of them were armed. They were formed into local militias by the Australian colonial government during the war to fight against the Japanese. And these white planters were not too happy about natives with guns, basically. So this is Bird writing this letter. Is there danger of a post-war flare-up among New Guinea natives? Which was published in an Australian regional news magazine called Pacific Islands Monthly. So I did a lot of work in the archives years ago, and as far as I could tell, this is the first occurrence of the term cargo cult in print. It wasn't by an anthropologist, it was by an Australian planter who was worried about dangerous natives flaring up. And if we could read that, you'll see he says, we gotta watch out, we could have cargo cults if we're not careful. So when the anthropologists went back into the Pacific after the war, because during the war there were a few anthropologists who worked for the US military as intelligence agents. There was a famous guy named Doug Oliver at the University of Hawaii for many years who was in New Caledonia, kind of working for the US Army during the war, collecting information which may or may not have been useful. After the war, anthropologists go back into the Pacific and they started publishing books not about kind of functionally unified, stable societies. Now they start writing about social change. And so from 56 to 64, there are a series of kind of, within anthropology in a way, famous case studies of social movements, of something going on, including Margaret Mead, who goes back to an island which is part of the country of Papua New Guinea, where she had been before the war, again looking at kids. After the war, she goes back to Manus Island and she's looking at a social movement called the Paleo movement. So if you ever take any Pacific anthropology, you'll come across some of this stuff. So what was a cargo cult? Well, anymore we would call it a kind of globalization movement. So what can happen when people and goods and ideas start moving around the world? And we've seen what happened here. What is happening here in the United States recently when lots of us Americans are made nervous by, oh, our towns are changing. I see new people in the supermarket. I hear different languages when I go to, the convenience store. There's strange looking kids at my kid's school, right? So when people move, when ideas move, when goods move, change might happen, and people sometimes want to accelerate change, or sometimes they want to go back to the old days. And we've got all kinds of terms for different kinds of movements, but I mean, going back to the old days, those are sometimes called nativistic movements, or revitalizing your own cultural system, those are by anthropologists and others, called vitalistic movements. But if you're looking for salvation, if you don't like what's going on now and you're looking for somebody to come, some prophet, or some spirit, or some whoever, to save you from your current situation. We've got labels for that too. Sometimes they're called millenarian movements or messianic movements. In the Pacific, these were called cargo cults. And they go back. I mean, these kinds of globalization movements you can trace back for many years, and really, certainly to 1492, when the old world and the new world come together for the first time, and there was movement, of course, before that. We have the Japanese probably coming over to the Americas from the one side, and the Vikings coming over to the Americas from the other side. After 1492, everybody, there was much much more movement than there was, and you can find all kinds of movements. So some of the well-known ones in American history are the Handsome Lake movement. He was a Seneca, he was a friend or at least an acquaintance of Thomas Jefferson, who preached a new way of life for the Seneca Indians. The Native American Church, I've been in Oklahoma for many years, so some of my neighbors up in Osage County are still members of the Native American Church. This starts in the 1890s. What's going on in the 1890s? Well, most Native American peoples have been rounded up on reservations, and there are a couple of final outbursts of violent resistance on both sides, but resistance from the 1890s turned towards religion as one place to look for salvation. Fighting the U.S. cavalry is just not going to work anymore, but maybe, the spirits can help you. So Native American Church, which is still with us today, emerges. The ghost dance, if anybody's taken any Western history, you may have heard of the ghost dance. This also sparks in the 1890s. This guy, Wavoka, who was a Paiute from Nevada, travels around the West, and he makes many converts among reservation people in Oklahoma. And part of his message is that if he was a nativistic guy, but also a kind of messianic guy, that if we would just do these dances, and they did circle dances, and if we would live a good life, the dead will come back to life. The dead buffalo herds, the disappeared buffalo herds will come back. So for a few years, ghost dancing was widespread among many kind of plains reservation peoples. And then in the northern part of the plains among the Sioux, they modified the message a little bit that if you would just wear this special painted shirt, U.S. cavalry army bullets wouldn't pass through your bodies. And so Sitting Bull was kind of associated with the ghost dance, or may not have been assassinated because of his connections with the ghost dance. But there are many others of these sculptures. You may have heard of the boxer movement. Martial arts, the outside observers called it boxing, but it was really a spiritual practice where your ancestors, if you did the right kind of Tai Chi or whatever kind of related system, would help you get rid of the evil European invaders who were moving in on rural China. They were messing with your coastal cities, but they were coming inland too. Rastafarians in Jamaica, here's another movement which continues today. People, former slaves in Jamaica looking to Haile Selassie in Ethiopia as a savior. Another name for Selassie was Rastafari. We got the Mau Mau in Kenya, which made a lot of trouble in the declining years of the Kenyan colony for the British. And then we got the Melanesian cargo cults, which, even though the word didn't exist until 1946, there were certainly social movements in the Pacific that were mostly anti-colonial. And they went on up through the 60s. When Melanesian countries, and those are the countries in the Southwest Pacific, that's Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, it was the New Hebrides, now Vanuatu, Fiji in particular. When those countries started to gain independence in the 1970s and 1980s, no more cargo culting. Different kinds of social action, but no more outbreaks of these strange cargo cults. So here's somebody, cargo cult comics. So as I mentioned before, anthropologists were always a bit embarrassed by the term cargo cult because it wasn't always, so the cargo cult story is this, right? If we engage in this new sort of ritual, so maybe it's reviving dancing that we haven't done for a while, maybe it's going to the graveyards where our ancestors are buried and pouring libations down on their graves. Certainly it's living well and not fighting amongst ourselves as much, not committing adultery, not getting rid of our sorcery stuff. Then somebody will come back and and improve our lives. And part of the improvement of life would be maybe we'll get our hands on some of the stuff that Europeans had in the Pacific. And after the war, we'll get our hands on some of the cargo that especially the US, brought down into the Pacific as part of the war effort. So back to Tana, where I ended up in 1978, there was something going on in the late 30s when people who, many of which had become Presbyterians or Catholics or Seventh-day Adventists, had to advance, transformations of their life, had given up a number of traditions, including dancing. The Presbyterians didn't like people to dance very much, including drinking kava, a local drug substance, which some of us, we talked about this morning, including, for a couple of men, polygamy, being married to more than one woman. And a lot of them had left their home villages to move down to resettle around coastal mission stations. In the late 30s, a spirit figure, which nobody's ever really identified, but I've met a number of people who said that they saw him and shook his hand, appeared and said, no, we need to go back to tradition. We need to revive our customs that our grandparents and parents gave up. And if we do this, the evil English and the evil French, which were the two colonial powers that together ran this archipelago, they'll leave. And before the war, it was our ancestors will come back and they will bring us stuff, cargo. So cargo in this part of the world was a pidgin English word that meant stuff, meant things. And then after the war, the story changed that if we just live a good life and we do our dances and we go back to drinking kava, then the Americans will come back and they'll bring back their cargo. So you can see here. And the mysterious figure who appeared to many people in the late 30s said his name was John Frum, although you see that in a number of versions. So here's some cartoonist cartooning the John Frum story. Probably hard to read, but a lot of the movement symbols then date back to war experience. So what happened, here's Tana, I'll get to that story in a minute. So Vanuatu is on the right. The island where I ended up and people are doing the John Frum movement is here. Here's that island. This place, Sulphur Bay, Ipakol, is one of the headquarters of the John Frum movement, and there's a bunch of people on the side who are doing their own thing, the Yakel Custom Village. And they're still there, and we'll see in a bit that tourists now go and they meet up with some John Frum people and some of the folks over here, and that's part of the tourist experience. So what happened on Tana in 1942 is the U.S. shows up in March of 1940. Pearl Harbor's 1941, December 1941. By March of 1942, the U.S. military sails into Port Vila Harbor, which is on another island, 2 islands north, and they set up camp there. The U.S. figures out it needs workers, so it starts recruiting what it called Native Labor Corps. About up to 2/3 of the U.S. presence in Vanuatu was African American, because especially after that first year, African American troops, white and black American troops were segregated. They used black troops mostly for cargo handling, for truck driving, for construction. And it was only later on into the war that they allowed a few of them into combat. Well, more than a few, but they started sending some segregated African American units into combat. But back on Tana, they recruited the population back then, maybe 6,000 people. But they recruited a couple thousand men. So almost every guy and boy on Tana was shipped north, 2 islands north, to work on U.S. military bases, handling cargo with black Americans. And they're dark-skinned folks in this part of the world. So they were amazed because up until the war, they'd only seen kind of creepy French and English guys. And the creepy French and English didn't treat them all that well. They didn't pay them all that well. They had established mostly coconut plantations throughout these islands. They needed labor. They would try to restrict the salary that they would earn. They wouldn't let them wear long trousers, all kinds of strange things. The Americans show up and they don't care, right? They want something done, they just start handing money away. And just idle soldiers, especially the first year was a little rough because nobody knew how far the Japanese were going to come down. But after the Battle of Guadalcanal, Japanese were kind of stopped and the lines start moving to the north, and these bases just become rear cargo bases, basically, where things are shipped through there heading north. So these guys, when they end up in, this is in Aparvila, this is the bigger American base up in Santo, but the population of the entire island chain was maybe 40,000 back in the 40s. Well, there's 100,000 American, mostly servicemen, some women, running around for 3 years, and then they all disappear. And they put in roads, airfields, so if ever anybody does tourism in the Pacific and goes to Fiji, goes to Samoa, goes to Tonga, goes to Vanuatu, goes to Solomon Islands, you're landing on an airfield that the U.S. military built, basically, and they're still used today for commercial aviation. They get medical care, from board military doctors. They live in labor camps, supervised by sometimes CB in the Navy, sometimes Army personnel. They are able to ride on and drive Jeeps, for the first time, and nobody had ever done that before, In this country, there were very few vehicles in the entire islands before the war, and they certainly, were reserved for the British and the French. So here are the guys on Tana, seeing a new world, basically, a different kind of European, or in this case, American. Because it was, it was a strange and bizarre world. It was the world of the military. Here are some of the U.S. supervisors with some of the Labor Corps bosses. And we had a project back in the late 80s when we went around Vanuatu and we interviewed as many people as we could find, men and women, about what had happened to them during the war. And I kind of ran the Vanuatu side of the story. Colleagues working up in the Solomon Islands, where things were a little bit different because there was actual fighting and much more disruption, and more people died up in the Solomons than folks down at Vanuatu. So you would, back in the 80s, you would find old guys who had worked on the U.S. bases during the 40s, in the 40s. This one, he said, oh, wait, I'll show you something. And he went inside his house, and they're living in these kind of homemade houses, and he drug out a pillowcase which was half full of American silver. Silver dollars, silver quarters, silver dimes, silver half dollars. I said, hide that, don't sell that cheap if you can. And he had just made the money washing clothes for U.S. service personnel, right? You didn't wash their own clothes, you paid somebody 50 cents to wash your shirt for you. Or he had made $1 climbing up a coconut tree to bring down a few coconuts for somebody. So most of these guys had great memories of the war because it was a wonderful time for them. They never made so much money in their life. They never had their hands on so much stuff in their life. They got to wear European clothes, which the British and the French had forbidden them to do. They had to wear lava-lavas or wraparound cloths. That's the only thing that they could wear. And then it all went away. It all went away. And so, except for the John Frum people, because they quickly wrote America into their resistance movement story. So their story wasn't that the ancestors would come back and save us if we just do these new rituals. Their story was that America would come back eventually and save us. So they were hot to get their hands on American flags, which didn't make the British and the French colonial powers happy. And Vanuatu became, the New Hebrides, the colony of the Nouvelles-Hebrides. New Hebrides became independent in 1980. And after independence, these guys' fondness for America didn't make the new national government much happier either. So this is an old friend of mine named Saki, who was a member of the John Frum drill team. So what they did is that they incorporated things like the US flag, if they could get them. There was a John Frum shrine looking over in the volcanoes right behind this lake, which has now disappeared. But in the shrine, you see they've incorporated, these are dog tags. Here's a soldier painted red, which is a powerful color. Here's a broken airplane. Here's a red cross. All of this comes from the war experience. And this is just a bunch of people's names as far as I could tell. But it's a gate. The gate itself comes out of local culture where gates are important on roads. But the rest of it is all stuff which people had experienced during the war and then became part of annual John Frum rituals. So February 15th became their Christmas, their annual big day, and it still goes today. So every February 15th, people will get together and they'll march around and they'll do skits and they'll have a feast of the remaining John Frum supporters on the island. Here's some of the leaders of the group this is probably back in the 80s, where they've found bits and pieces of stuff that could be uniform. And they're marching out to make some speeches. So this continues to attract lots of attention. They've been on television many times. There have been many documentaries made about them. And others. There are a few other former cargo cults now institutionalized into local political parties and local social organizations. There are a few that survive up in Papua New Guinea. There's one on the big island of Guadalcanal in the Solomons, and then there's one up in the northern part of Vanuatu, and then there's the John Frum people down in Tana. So they would pray in front of red crosses, and here you see them combining both something they borrowed from Christianity, the prayer and the flower offerings, and the Red Cross, which they saw on the doors of military ambulances. Here's an old slide. This is late 70s, where they got their hands on some American flag. And they put the British and the French flag, this is during the colonial period, on the gate, on the periphery, but they put the US flag in the center. So this used to drive all of the British and the French weren't happy with this at all. So there certainly were and are social movements in the Pacific, which certainly were connected with colonialism, or in the broader context with globalization, with people moving in on you that you didn't invite, with powerful forces asking you to live your life a little differently, where maybe you don't want to live your life a little differently. So what do? You resist if you can. So that was going on. Whether the label cargo cult really captured everything about these movements, anthropologists soon decided it did not, even though we used that label for many years. But you can see this is a book from the late 80s, 90s, written about a movement in Fiji. And she's already saying, oh, it's not about cargo and it's not a cult. About a specific Fijian movement that had started actually in the late 19th century. Here's another book coming out of a conference that was held in Denmark, and it was called cargo cult, but they're going to criticize it. They're going to say, well, it's more complicated than that. But anthropologists kind of have lost control. So the rest of my talk here, I'm going to try to follow some of the weird places where the term cargo cult has ended up. So we're not in control. We stole the term, it wasn't me, but my elder anthropologist stole the term from this rabid Australian planter who was afraid of native uprisings, but we used it. But we're not the only ones to use it. So this is the well-known David Attenborough. I don't know. He and his brother, Richard, are kind of famous talking heads out of Britain. He traveled around the Pacific in 1959 doing a television show. And one of the episodes of the show, he goes to Tana and tries to discover the truth of the mysterious John Frum people. So he talks to this John Frum cult leader, movement leader, a guy named Thomas Nambas. And I won't spend too much time here. He's trying to say, okay, Nambas, tell me the truth about John Frum. And Nambas is very wise and very cagey. And he wants to know, what's cargo? And what sort of things will there be in cargo? This is David Attenborough, and Nambas is talking half Pidgin English, Bislama and Vanuatu. And Nambas is not, he's going to bring everything. He's going to bring America people, it shows up there too. And here's Attenborough saying, well, is it food? Is it going to be an icebox, right? Nambas doesn't say everything. Here's Attenborough, cars? Nambas won't agree, right? And then Attenborough says, everything that the white people have, white man has now, and Nambas says yes. So he's really trying to tell the cargo part of that story, Attenborough. He's one of many who would come, who says, okay, these people are really interested in our stuff. And it makes sense, because our stuff is great. Everybody ought to want our stuff, right? Because we want our stuff. It makes sense that distant natives out there in the bush, should want our stuff too. And one time I was kind of interested to see what the stuff was supposed to be. So I went through anthropological and other accounts. So Nambas wouldn't list what cargo was supposed to be, because I think it meant more to him than just things. But if you notice, it kind of struck me, this is calico, torches, refrigerators, icebox, refrigerators, fridges, which really caught my eye because nobody's got electricity in Vanuatu. People during the war, even today, I go back to Samaria village, there's no electricity. Nobody can have a refrigerator. Nobody has a refrigerator. They don't like their food cold anyway. So why does the refrigerator show up on all these accounts of the cargo? I think it's something that we certainly want, so we're kind of putting our own desires into the mouths of faraway Pacific Islanders to make sense of our own desires. At least that's my interpretation of it. And you certainly see that motif, the fridge motif. So here's a kid's book written about cargo cults by some guy named Harold Goodwin. What's on the cover? It's the refrigerator, right? Here's another cargo cultist surrounding a fridge. Here's another one from a kid's encyclopedia. John Frum and his white cargo plane arrive on Tana, and what's there? There's a fridge. Or here's some website. Cargo cult then evades the World Wide Web. And there's all sorts of cargo cult websites out there if you want to have a look. So somebody's site, I think it's a joke. So here's the Red Cross from the John Frum movement. And if you pray, you will become a fridge. So as anthropologists have backed away from the term cargo cult, it's really more complicated than that. It's not just cargo. These are social movements of people who want to change their lives, and they have all kinds of futures in mind. And what they have in mind is not us. They don't want to become us. It's smart. Anthropologists like to complicate things. So, they've got their own future imaginations, It's not just they want our stuff. So we've abandoned the term. Hardly any anthropologist today would say that I'm going to go study cargo cults. And you would probably not get a research visa if you told some independent government, I want to come down and study your strange and bizarre cargo cultists. So it doesn't pay, right? But we've lost control of the term. Now it's out there. And we don't believe in cargo cults anymore, which is why I call this cargo cult post-mortem. Lots of other people like that term and are still using the term. So here's cargo cult lager, cargo cult wine. And here's one of the documentaries that was made a couple of years ago by a New York City documentarian. I was trying to tell her, it's not cargo, it's not cult, but she insisted to go down to Tana, and she made an okay film. It starts with Mondokane. I don't know if anybody's seen Mondokane, but it was the first shockumentary made by an Italian production team in the early 60s. It just went around the world and presented weird stuff from around the world, and the concluding weirdness was the cargo cult by Giacobetti was the producer. So the term now survives as a useful insult. So you could think you're doing something good, but no, you're just a cargo cultist. Because you think if you just do this thing, you're going to succeed, but you're not using rational thinking, right? So sometimes it's what you want is wrong. If you actually get that, your life is going to be miserable. Or sometimes, yes, it's a good thing to want that, but that's not, culting is not the way to get it. You need to go to school and get educated and work hard, and then, okay, you'll get this stuff. So if you want to criticize somebody, cargo cult has been a useful term for a lot of people to say, you're just like those crazy Melanesians, you're cargo cultists. So cargo cult thinking, it's magic. Or sometimes it could be noble, but I'll go through some of the insult ones. So this is somebody complaining about, I don't know what, but whatever it is, it's not going to work because it's cargo cult. Here's some baseball strategy, which is cargo cult strategy, because that's not going to work either. Here is transportation planning, which is like a cargo cult. Here is computer programming, which is like cargo cult computer planning. Here's politics. This is from 2008 when Kucinich was still alive. He's going to suck all the life out of the American peace cargo cult. Here is John Frum used as John McCain as just like island cargo cults. Here's, I don't know, what's this one? Trump is just like a cargo cult. Here's some more Democratic Party, blah, blah, blah. Economics is bad cargo cult. So the term is there. It's still, you might see it out there. If you just Google it, you'll find cargo cult. And sometimes it's just, you're crazy and insane, just like the people in Tana who thought that if they just marched around, the Americans would come back and bring them stuff. But it's been spun sometimes to be like a noble, cargo culting is a way to rediscover your true self, to get back to your honest traditions and ancestry. So there was a famous Catholic monk, Thomas Merton, who wrote a number of poems, and he worked cargo cult into his poem, talked about John Frum in his poems. A number of artists have discovered cargo cult. There's a few cargo cult rock bands out there and publishing houses. Here's some artists, Rory Johnson's cargo cult fake stamp issue, wooden cargo cult robots from Japan. Here's, I don't know if they're still doing business, but there was a musical group, the Cargo Cult Alchemy. Here you can go to the Cargo Cult shop. I forget where the Cheddar Caves and Gorge might be, but here's Cargo Cult Fashion, what Snowboarder's model here. And Burning Man. Has anybody been to Burning Man? It's a big naked party where 50,000 people show up in the deserts of Nevada every year. Well, the 2013 theme was cargo cult, if you wanted to go to Burning Man. So here's some Burning Man 2013 images, and they worked in John Frum. So people in Tana, nobody knows where Tana is, but here they are in the deserts of Nevada for all the Burning Man people. And then back on Tana now, they can sell themselves to tourists. Oh, come see us, we're the cargo cultists. So in addition to the volcano, which I'll talk about at 1 o'clock, a few tourists also show up because they want to see the cargo cult. So Tana Beach Resort, which is still in business, you can see that they're selling there. Come for the kava, the custom villages, and the cargo cultists. And On the west side of the island, they've incorporated Prince Philip of Great Britain into the story, so he's the ancestor who's going to come back and save them all. They just lost some of the pictures in a flood, and the palace I saw sent them a letter a couple of months ago that they're going to replace the photos of Prince Philip, so they're still okay, they're still good. Montana Beach cargo culting, I'm going to go fast through here. So why so much cargo cult? A lot of us haven't ever heard of it, but my concluding interpretation is what I suggested before, that we like the story for a couple of reasons, because if other people want what we have, oh, we must be cool. That's one of our story. The other part of the story is, why should we want it, right? So these are stories of people's endless desires that are never met. And you can ask yourself, what would happen to the American economy if you actually ended up with everything you ever wanted? What would happen to American romance if you actually found the person in your life that you're really happy with forever? Everything would grind to a stop, right? So if you're a suspicious anthropologist, you could say we like to tell the cargo cult story because it makes sense of the way that we desire things and makes sense of our understandings of desire as something that never can be ultimately fulfilled. Because if you've reached your end of your desires, you're a Buddhist and you've hit nirvana and you're never going to be reborn again, and the circle of life is going to stop right there. So we can never, the system must cultivate a kind of desire in our bodies that is never ultimately fulfillable. We have to always keep on moving and moving and moving toward the goal. So Calvin and Hobbes, the old comic strip, kind of caught on to that story too. So that's your patriotic duty to buy something. It's our patriotic duty. So if anybody's interested in the cargo cult, especially John Frum, I've got a couple of books on that. You can kind of look them up. And thank you very much. Our last slide from Burning Man, so I'm happy to